Welcome, welcome, dear friends, returning to RAYfest and to new people who are joining us. Welcome. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. And thank you for joining us for our online festival celebrating women of spirit. I'm your host, Simon Dyer, and together with Fatima Ashraf, we are the co-creators of Ray of God. Ray seeks to share feminine spiritual wisdom to help realize God in all ways and to align with justice, truth, and beauty. The energetic state of the feminine is our guiding principle and holds our intention. And we believe that all genders hold the feminine and masculine within themselves. And while we are women-led and women-centered, we welcome and encourage all genders to join us in helping to create safer, more inclusive spaces. Ray does not seek to present a voice of expertise. We see ourselves as travelers along the way and learning with each step. And our ideas are constantly evolving, and we're very grateful to have you joining us on this journey to deeper consciousness. So the aim of the festival this year is to rise, vocalize, and deepen. And our contributors have been speaking to the broad theme of her voice. When we challenge the generational silencing of women and control of our bodies, how can we begin to heal our relationship with self, other, and the divine? And we've been blessed to be welcoming over the course of this weekend a diverse array of intergenerational, interspiritual contributors, religious leaders, spiritual teachers, activists, academics, creatives, and so much more. And this weekend also leads us into All Hallows Eve, All Saints Eve, and Samhain, the midway point between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, and a time to honor the saints. And we hold in our awareness that there will be many around the world in ceremony and prayer at the same time that our festival is unfolding. So I'm delighted to welcome you to our final heart-to-heart conversation of this weekend, but of course the heart-to-heart conversations continue always. And we're asking our contributors to speak to the theme, and we also welcome your questions that you can submit through the chat function to myself. Feel free to ask whatever questions come to your heart, just being mindful that our contributors are also on a journey like each of us and deserve our love and respect in being willing to share from their hearts in such an open forum. So I'm delighted to welcome, returning from the first RAYfest that we had in 2020, Rabbi Dr Jill Hammer. She's an author, ritualist, scholar, poet, dreamworker, just all-round delicious feminine energy in all aspects. And she's the director of spiritual education at the Academy for Jewish Religion and the co-founder of the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute. I'll be hearing more about the work that she's been doing there and her books as well. So welcome, Jill, returning, thank you. And joining Jill, we have Dr. Sofia Rehman, who I've been very lucky to have joined her book club. I don't know if it's been a year, maybe it's been less than a year, online. You can find more information for both Jill and Sofia in their bios on the website. And you have links to join anything that they will be doing as well, and we'll share it at the end too. Sofia is a scholar, an independent scholar, specializing in Islam and gender, an author and an educator. And she's also acquisitions editorial executive at Neem Tree Press. She's the founder and coordinator of Leeds Lit Book Club, which is now in its 8th year, and also an online one, which I'm part of too. And she's written for various publications and chapters for anthologies. But what I'm very excited about, and we'll hopefully be speaking more about in this conversation, is her book coming out next spring, which is on the sayings, the hadith narrated by the Prophet's wife, Hazrat Aisha. So looking forward to speaking more about that. Thank you both for being with us today. And I'm going to just dive into this conversation, and maybe with a kind of an open question for both of you, and perhaps Jill could start us off, which is how does the feminine voice rise up in you? And what does that mean to you and your relationship to your voice? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaima, and I want to say what an honor and a pleasure it is to be back at RAYfest. It's really my joy, and it's also my my honor to be with Dr. Rehman in this forum. How does the voice of the feminine rise up in me? How do I stop it? It's actually sometimes more authentic to my experience, because often I have a sense of the bubbling of this voice that wants to come out and that has had in some ways so little opportunity to express itself in ways that can be heard. So, you know, when I'm in sacred space, I think I you know, with women and with you know, people who are wanting to support that journey, I think there is a sense of the, you know, of the eagerness that this voice has to emerge. And some of the ways that I experience it in my own sort of on my own journey, one way really has to do with trying to find and to channel and to share voices of the ancestors. And that can happen through, you know, searching through texts and folklore and archaeology, and, you know, for some indication of what might have been going on, you know, 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, that often wasn't recorded, and really by design wasn't recorded, right? Those voices were not considered important, or if they were recorded, they weren't saved. But sometimes you get hints of them. You get hints of them in sacred text. You get hints of them in folk traditions. And so to find those pieces and bring them out and think about how can we live into these examples in the present, I think that's you know, that's a piece that I feel urgent about and passionate about. And when I teach, you know, often there's much of my own voice in that, but there's also a sense of how can I let these often submerged, hidden, or kind of complex, you know, complexly located voices come out in ways that will allow us as a living modern community to experience them. So that's a big piece for me, and one of the things that drives my own teaching and practice. Another place that the voice of the feminine arises for me is in prayer, and in particular, I often pray either online or on retreat with the Kohenet community, as you mentioned when you read my bio. And we shift Jewish liturgy in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways that we shift it is that our prayers are often addressed to the feminine, right? In feminine grammar, right? And with some kind of, right, femme imagery happening. And that has been a really powerful prayer experience for me that I think I always wanted. When I was young and sort of looking into various myths from different cultures, I was interested in this line of the feminine. What is this, you know, what is this sacred archetype sound like, feel like, look like? And to be in contexts where it feels authentic to pray toward, you know, toward that, you know, that aspect of the divine image is powerful for me. And one of the teachings of the Kabbalah, of the Jewish mystical tradition, is that prayer is an embodiment of the Shekhinah. Prayer is an embodiment of the divine feminine presence. And so trying to allow that to come up in me, you know, feels like an important way that voice is expressed. And when I hear others in that mode of prayer and sharing, you know, that's a way that I hear that voice. And the third thing I'll say is that when I write creatively, there is a sense of collaboration with something, you know, with some creative presence that is beyond me, and that there is a sense of some kind of interface that I'm tapping into that I don't really understand and can't really be conscious of, but that something is happening that allows for surprising things to emerge, and ways that that the presence can be expressed and the feminine presence can be expressed. So So those are some ways that it arrives, and I associate it with a particular feeling of almost like a cork being pulled out of a bottle that is carbonated. You know, there's a particular feeling of rising up in a foaming sort of way, like a cherry tree blooming. I guess I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. I love this rising, and also when does the feminine not speak? How wonderful. Sophia?
Thank you. What a beautiful way to start the session. I'm just sitting here in awe. I mean, I was already in awe before we got started of Jill. So to begin with, where she finds the feminine voice is just so beautiful, and actually really resonated as well. There's many points at which I really felt, yes, I recognize that. So when you spoke about writing, I thought, yeah, that's definitely a place where I find the divine feminine emerge. And there's a surah in the Quran, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, is Surah Al-Qalam. And it starts Noon wal Qalam. And Noon, it's just the letter Noon, which is it's almost like a bowl and a dot on top. And some of the exegetes of the Quran have said that so the Noon, which is just this letter on its own, it's a mystical letter. Nobody really knows what this letter stands for. There's been lots of different ideas, and people have hypothesized on what it could mean, but there's no definitive answer as to what the purpose of that letter on its own is. And it's followed by the word wal qalam, by the pen, that God is making this oath by the pen, this mighty weapon that many of us wield even. And that the Noon is the divine ink pot, so that when you dip into that and you write, you're writing from this place of having dipped into the divine ink pot. But what I love also is that, so the verse goes, Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun. So Allah says Noon, and Allah swears by this almighty pen and what it records, what is written by it. And then the next line, Allah says, Ma anta bi ni'mati rabbika bi majnoon. You, by the grace of your God, are not mad. You, by the grace of your God, are not mad. And how often is it that we as women especially, or marginalized folk, start to write something, especially if we are writing about God, especially if we are writing about our connection to the divine and our interpretations of sacred text? How often is that the first accusation we are met with? You're mad, you're crazy, you don't know what you're talking about, you're loopy, crazy women with their emotional ovaries taking over all their writing, and so on and so forth, for those of us who have ovaries. And, so I love that. I totally agree. I completely resonate with the idea that writing is a place wherein there is this connection with the divine, and that there's this freedom to be found within the act of writing, and that there is this imperative by God, go ahead, write, and then be strong about what you've written about. And people might call you crazy, but it's okay. The best of us has been called crazy. You just keep on writing what you have to write. So certainly I think there is a divine flow that happens within us when we sit to pour out the words that have often been sort of bubbling away within us for longer than we actually even realize. So thank you for that. I really love that, that writing is a place where we find the divine. I think that for me personally, though, that question of voice is something that I grapple with all the time. It occupies me most of my time these days. And I was talking about it with my therapist, as one does, and I said to her, well, how do we know that the voice that we're hearing is our own? Because I believe that is where the divine voice is found. I mean, I loved Karen George's conversation yesterday when I asked her about, well, where is that spirit? And she said it's within us. And I agree with that. And in the Quran as well, we're told that Allah is closer to us than our jugular vein. I mean, that's just so beautiful. This part of us, which is actually probably the most vulnerable part of us, if that gets cut, it's game over, and Allah is closer to us than that. And so this idea that Allah is so close to this part of us, this part on our necks, on our throats. It's so vulnerable, but it is also the point at which our voice box resides. It's just too perfect to be a coincidence, right? So I asked my therapist, how do I know when it's my voice and not all these other voices that I've internalized? Because we live in a society that is so strongly patriarchal. And we're raised with these patriarchal expectations, and oftentimes we're made to feel, and this is the great trickery of patriarchy, that if you toe the line, you'll be safe. And of course, we know that even if you toe the line, you're never safe. So I was talking to her and I said, how do I know when it's my voice and not some other voice that I've internalized? And she said, well, that's the $1 million question. So we carried on in the session, and then I said, at the end of the session, I had a bit of an aha moment, because I had mentioned an event in which I didn't shrink myself, and I spoke up, and she reminded me of that. And I said, oh, so would you say then that we know it's our own voice when it's one that nurtures and raises us, and it's one that doesn't force us to shrink ourselves, and it's one that urges us to speak our truth? She said, in the way that good therapists do, possibly. And I loved that. And it was a real moment. And I thought, yes, when this voice is encouraging me to growth, and is encouraging me to truth, and is encouraging me to step outside of the restrictions that I know to be unjust and unfair, when it forces me to speak up against an injustice that I see against someone else, that is the divine that is manifesting itself within me. And I think linked to that then is also constantly trying to listen to the marginalized, constantly trying to be aware of my own inadequacies and where my own prejudices reside, and being open and available to being prodded against those, and to be held accountable for those as well. And to know that as much as I want to be an agent of justice in this world, there will be times when I will be the opposite of that, and I have to be accountable for that. And I have to allow when that divine voice comes out of someone else and holds me accountable. So the divine voice resides both within me, but also within all those who are around me. There is something for me to learn from. And the final thing that I will mention, and it might sound trite, but it is very much in nature. It's very much in going out into the world and relocating myself within nature as a part of nature. And I've been thinking about this a lot more recently, because I've been writing or attempting to write an essay on nature and women of color within nature. And I thought, yeah, I'm a woman of color, but primarily I'm a woman of faith. So that is the thing that always rises to the fore on my experience of anything. And I was thinking of the statement that we make when we lose something, or when we're in calamity, or when somebody passes away. We say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. We say, from Allah we come, and to her we return. And I was thinking about the two entry points and exit points from which we come into the world and leave the world. And that we enter the world through a womb. And, you know, Wadud this morning so beautifully talked about Rahim and the womb, and the connection between Rahman, Rahim, Rahim, you know, the womb. Allah is merciful, most kind, most compassionate, and the notion of mercy. And I thought, goodness, how you know, patriarchy has completely removed the holiness of that. You know, now we talk about, well, when a woman has a baby, then she's impure for 30 days, 40 days, for as long as she's... Can you imagine if men gave birth? You know, like we would see this for the sacred act that it is. And then I was thinking about the exit point. So when we leave this earth, we're settled back into the ground. And the ground, this earth, is speaking to us so loudly, and yet we are refusing to listen. As a whole, humankind is refusing to listen to the earth as it speaks out to us. So I think that the divine voice, the divine feminine is everywhere around us. It permeates everything, us, the people around us, the earth that we occupy. and the stations through which we entered into this world, and pondering that is a real, is my way of trying to connect to the feminine. But I hear, Jill, as you said, that, you know, it's more often about trying to suppress the feminine from coming out, and or not so much suppress, but, you know, sort of keep it under some sort of wrap. But I find, and I wonder if maybe if I could ask you, Simon, if you don't mind, if I could ask you about how in a patriarchal world, and all of us were born into this patriarchal world, and I think especially for those of us who are deeply faithful, and you know, sadly institutionalized religion is so deeply patriarchal, how does one mine for that feminine voice within, that feminine divine voice, and allow it to just be so explosively eager to come to the fore?
So Ima, should I just jump in? Is that okay? Oh no, it's great. Thank you. I'm still thinking about the divine ink pot. I think I'm going to be with that for the rest of the day. That was pretty fabulous. Thank you for your beautiful sharing. How do you mine for that? Well, one way, I mean, I can think of a few ways, but my tradition gave me access to an interpretive process that is called midrash, which is a kind of, which means it comes from the word for seeking, and it's a kind of expansive, creative form of textual interpretation, right? Where you're reading the text and you're trying to understand what the text says, but you're also asking questions the text doesn't answer, and then sort of looking for hints of how you might answer that question. And often those hints have a lot to do with the person who's reading the text, right? So a midrash will ask, so, you know, why did Lot's wife look back? You know, the text doesn't say, you know, like, why is that? And then there'll be a whole story about, you know, she was looking for her lost daughters, you know, you know, the question will be, so, you know, what happened at Sarah's death? You know, the story doesn't say, and you know, there'll be a story about that. So I had access to this kind of creative interpretive tool that was a way of saying, you know, your voice gets to matter here, like in dialogue, you know, with what has come before. And I think that interpretive tool has been really helpful to me in trying to create a voice that is still connected, but that is not kind of controlled by or you know, suppressed by, you know, patriarchal voices, you know. So that's one thing I think, is that when we're engaged unapologetically, right? And I think it's very easy to feel apologetic, right? I actually remember receiving this message from some of my teachers in rabbinical school, like, all right, we're letting you in here, like, don't break anything, you know, like, you know, don't say anything that's going to wreck the whole tradition, okay? You know, and in some way I had to work through that and be like, I'm not, you know, you guys aren't worried about that. I'm not here to worry about that either. You know, I'm here to share my authentic voice. So that is a piece. I think another piece is around community, you know, and finding context to express this voice. You know, one of the reasons that I you know, participated in the co-founding of Kohenet was that I wanted there to be an environment where there wasn't an immediate shh, you know, where someone would say something about a story or about themselves, you know, and the community wouldn't immediately say, you're not allowed to say that, don't say that. You know, and so often we receive that voice either explicitly or indirectly. And I wanted to see, well, what would happen if we actually didn't let that voice into the room? You know, if we said, you know, you can wait out there, right? And we're going to actually say what's on our hearts and, you know, what's in our consciousness. And the impact, you know, for so many was really extraordinary. So creating those communities where voices can be heard, I think, you know, as you named, you know, and, you know, in those communities, that's how we learn not only how to be accountable and also how to connect, right, to one another. And I guess I'll share one other thing, and maybe some of you will relate to this, which is that some contemporary feminists actually get some of their ideas from dreaming. right? Because dreams don't care about rules. They don't care, about gravity. They don't care about, who's supposed to do what. And sometimes you'll wake up with an image. Like one of my first, really revelatory dream experiences was of dreaming of God as a pregnant woman. And I had read that image in poems, but until the dream, I didn't own it as this is actually a voice from beyond myself, or beyond, my human community. So those are some ways, I think. And the last thing I want to say is that I think it takes work. And I remember during the first week of retreats that we met, the Kohenet Institute met, really noticing a very uncomfortable feeling in the room. And I experienced it as almost like a nausea, and there was a sense of, I'm doing something completely transgressive, and I feel like I shouldn't be doing this, and it feels scary, and I feel sick. And I had to work through that this was not me. This was everything I had internalized about what was dangerous to say and to do. And so I think being aware that I would imagine almost all of us have some version of that screen, inside us, and it's not so easy to look, peer around that and come out of that. And I'm just thinking of, that I know that when in generations past, when learned Jewish women would teach Torah, they would often teach from behind a screen, like in order to preserve their modesty. And there's something cool about that image, but for me, there's also a sense of, that's what it's like. It's like you're behind a screen and you have to figure out how to get your voice, around. So, so thank you for the question. And I so look forward to hearing more about how you managed to find your way to the divine ink pot.
I love that. Thank you. That's such a great answer, and again, something that I can really relate to as well. I see that so when I set up this Islam and gender critical reading group, sort of at the beginning of the first pandemic, when we were all, excited about Zoom instead of suffering from Zoom fatigue, I really didn't think I would have that much interest. I didn't think people would want to read an academic text by, a Muslim woman who has been vilified within the Muslim community for her writing. I mean, that seems to be the sad reality for a lot of these academic women, scholars of Islam, who find a sort of a sanctity, almost not sanctity, a safe space in academia where you can talk about these things, and then you very quickly realize that there's a lot of things that you can't talk about, and it's not quite the safe space that you thought it was. But that's perhaps a different conversation. I mean, it's just the layers of silencing that the female voice experiences, isn't it? So there's one within the community, and then you step out of the community and you think you've found a sanctuary somewhere else, and then you realize that there's a different form of violence done against your voice there. But anyway, I set up this reading group, and I thought, because I've often recommended certain texts and people are enthusiastic, they want to read these texts, but then they come to them and they're like, the language went over my head, it was too heavy to read, it wasn't, it's inaccessible, the language is for academics, it's not for the lay Muslim person. And I thought, well, it's the lay everyday Muslim woman, if you want to call her lay, who has the most to benefit from this work. So there's this it's still this patriarchal imposition, right? Because these women who have wanted to engage the Muslim texts, the sacred texts, and who want to write about it in a more gender egalitarian way, have had to find refuge in the patriarchal white supremacist academy to be able to do so. And then that academy, that institution, then enforces upon them ways of presenting that argument, which then makes it difficult to access to the very first community who they would have sought to service. So I thought, okay, you know what, I'm going to come in and be that bridge between the two, and I'm going to facilitate readings, and this is how the reading group that Simon referred to at the beginning, and who she is an intrinsic member of, came about. And yeah, I've had so many moments where people have called out and said, you know, I almost left my faith, but you know, this space has reinstated it. I don't want to take credit for it, but the space has reinstated their faith. The space has reinstated their connection to God, and it's just profoundly uplifting for me when I hear that, but at the same time very depressing, because I think, well, why was that link ruptured in the first place? Why was it severed? And yes, the layers of sort of silencing that happen to the female voice are so many, and that's why I think that anytime a woman speaks up, there is always going to be something of the divine in there. And if I may, you know, like there's a trend that slightly disturbs me, and it may seem a little, you know, adjacent to the conversation, but I think it links back. So just as women have started to speak out, and I think the internet was really intrinsic in that. I mean, before we started today's session, I was saying to Jill that I feel like I already know you because I received these emails from the Feminism and Religion blog, and to which Jill is an exquisite contributor. And so the internet has played this role in allowing us to speak up and to be heard and to offer alternative and disruptive ways of reading sacred text. And now there's a strange trend, especially on social media, of not speaking. So women are visible, but there'll be like music going on around and they're just pointing at things. And I've done that. Or it's another voiceover and we're just lip syncing to it. And there's something disturbing in that for me, that just as we found our voices, we're by our own hands sort of silencing ourselves again. I mean, I don't know if this is something that you've recognized, or if anybody else has noticed this. It worries me, especially for the younger generations that are coming up, and for whom the internet and social media in particular are such important central tools to hearing an alternative voice, and to voicing their alternative thoughts. And now we are doing this strange trend of, and we have to do it because the algorithm begs us of it, you know. So if that's is that something that you see? Is that, sorry, Simon, maybe if you want to come in with something.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's completely kind of you're already. Did you see my notes beforehand? Like you just.
I didn't know.
You're going towards it. It's wonderful.
I can't communicate.
Yes, exactly. Heart to heart connections are definitely there. I was just thinking a moment before actually that I'd forgotten for just a split second. I forgot I was facilitating, and I was just kind of like sat back and just like, you know, I felt like, oh, I'm just witnessing this conversation. It's wonderful. No, I definitely want to continue, and you know, you make a really important point about this self-silencing that women are doing, because to me it connects to conversations that, you know, we've had with many, you know, of the women here today, that even when we get the permission to speak, it's so difficult to speak out, and it's so easy to hide behind something again. So even in these trends in social media, you know, we think we're putting ourselves out there, but we're still letting ourselves be hidden, you know, in ways that kind of reinforce the fact that we're not quite confident, we don't feel quite like we can take up space. You know, and I always bring it back to a very Islamic practice of when women feel inhibited to, for example, do the azan, you know, and there's always this conversation about, you know, what about, you know, her voice is better than my voice, I don't have a very good voice. And I always say, do you think a man ever has these considerations when he's asked to do the azan? Like, you know, any man of any congregation, you know, in a mosque around the world, if he's asked to do the azan, he'll just do it. And I always think to myself, I'd love to know, is there a similar I don't think there's a similar thought process of like, that guy's got a more beautiful voice than I do, I don't feel like I can do it. But it's a self-censorship, you know. And I think as much as we look at external influences that censor us, again, it's about, and Sofia, you said this right at the beginning, about looking within ourselves to see what is it that we're complicit in, and how are we preventing ourselves. But I want to continue with this vocalizing, right? So you're both talking about vocalizing the truth. I love, Jill, what you said about, you know, dismantling the tradition. I very much of the opinion of like, we need to smash tradition. And I've spoken to Dr. Amna Wadud about this, and it comes back to this whole, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. But there's also this learning of what is it we're trying to dismantle. So as much as I resist it, and I'm learning this through Sofia's book club, is learning about these systems. So then we have the strength to think, okay, this is how it's not working, and this is how we need to dismantle it, and this is how we create new traditions for the times that we are in. And I feel that you're both doing this. You're creating new traditions, and you're vocalizing your truth, but you're helping others to vocalize their truth. And I wanted to ask both of you just to speak more, Jill, with the Kohenet Institute, and what this amazing institute that you've created, a global vehicle for helping Jewish women reclaim their priestess tradition. And then Sofia, with the work that you're doing with I'm part of this group of people that is learning from you and learning how to voice my truth as well. And so maybe Sofia, if you want to continue, and then we can move on to Jill, that'd be great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about today's session, I was thinking very much about an essay that I wrote for Cut from the Same Cloth. And it's incredible to me how we can have a female voice right so conspicuously in the center of the Quran, and yet we don't know it because we're not taught it. It's not a lesson that's repeated again and again at the minbar and at the pulpit by the imam, or in the masjids with our teachers. And in Surah Mujadila of the Quran, it's the 58th chapter of the Quran. This whole chapter of the Quran is revealed. It means she who disputes, which I just love. I love, firstly, that the Quran would even have a chapter entitled "She Who Disputes." Like, nothing is mentioned in the Quran except that it is an elevated point. We are so enamored, especially by the chapter titles of the Quran. I think as a Muslim community, we find we really do sanctify them, and yet nobody's thought to say that a woman who argues, an argumentative woman, is a good thing, and yet we know that an argumentative woman is exactly what this is. This chapter of the Quran is named after, and it's the story of Khawla bint Khuwaylid. Sorry, I had a moment there. Khawla bint Khuwaylid, and the story is actually narrated by Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. And she, Khawla goes to the Prophet ﷺ and complains to him that her husband Aus has pronounced this sort of divorce, this pre-Islamic type of divorce, which is called the Zihar, which left a woman essentially socially suspended. She was no longer the responsibility of her husband anymore, but she wasn't allowed to remarry. So the pronouncement was something along the lines of, you are to me like the back of my mother, meaning that he, is not going to have intimate relations with her, but he's not going to be financially responsible for her either. But she cannot move into another relationship. So Khawla goes to the Prophet ﷺ and complains to him and says, look, this, I've borne him children, I have been in a lifetime of service to this man, and now that, I'm older, he just wants to pronounce this sort of divorce on me and leave me, without any kind of support or any freedom to move on from him. Now, the Prophet didn't feel like he could say anything to her because he hadn't received any instruction on this. So she sits there and she continues to argue with the Prophet. She's like, well, I'm not leaving here until I get a response. But she is heartbroken. And Aisha talks about having witnessed this, and the other women folk in the home of the Prophet, they are moved to tears. And they just sit crying as they listen to Khawla and her complaint to the Prophet ﷺ, and as they witness the incapacity of the Prophet to respond. And whilst they're there, and whilst she's disputing, and the thing that I adore about this story is how her voice goes beyond the Prophet, beyond the earth, up through the heavens, and shakes the throne of Allah into an immediate response. I mean, even the Prophet didn't always get that. Like, we know that after the first revelation, there was almost a year before the Prophet received anything again. And, you know, and he was in a state of so much anxiety, like, was he going mad? Was this a jinn? What was going on? But Chola went to the Prophet with this plea against an act of injustice against her, and Allah responded. And it's a beautiful response, and Allah immediately, you know, rebukes and does away with this practice, this method of divorce, and it is immediately dropped from Muslim practice. But there's a penance that must be paid, right? So, you know, Aus isn't going to just be able to come and, you know, be with his wife again or be intimate with his wife or anything like that. He needs to pay for his abominable utterance. And so the first thing that the Quran offers by way of this is that, you know, the man should go and free a slave. And if he doesn't have that, then he should fast 2 months. And if he doesn't have that, then he needs to feed 60 people. Now, you know, that's 3 options that he's been given. And you would think that Chola would just jump for joy. Yep, okay, fabulous. I can go back to my husband. I can tell him that what he uttered has no place in Islam. We are still married. Da, 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 da. But she doesn't. She actually continues then to advocate for her husband. She says, listen, my husband, he cannot free a slave. We don't have slaves. He cannot fast 2 months consecutively because he is too enfeebled. He cannot do that. And he cannot actually even feed 60 poor people because we don't have the finances to be able to do that. And what I love again is the response of the Prophet now. So his immediate inability to respond to her upset him clearly, but he didn't have the words to say anything. And now that he has received this divine intervention, this divine instruction, he says to her, okay, can you feed 30 people? She says, yes. He said, okay, I'll feed the other 30. You know, he becomes this co-conspirator with her. You know, that is what allyship looks like. You know, he says, right, you feed 30, I'll feed 30. And I think the whole story is such a beautiful example of how the Muslim community should be holding one another. That when a woman raises her voice to give word to an injustice that is happening, that the women around her, like Aisha and the other women folk of that household, don't move to silence her. They don't act as handmaidens of the patriarchy and tell her, well, it's not that bad. They don't tell her, look, this is tradition, this is how it's always been. They sit in absolute compassion and empathy with her. And if they cannot offer her anything, they can at least offer their solidarity in the moment. The Prophet, on the other hand, too, he also doesn't make any of those statements, and he waits patiently. And for all we know, he may have been making prayer, you know, seeking out, calling out within his heart for a response from Allah. And then he gets that response, and he puts himself within the activity that Chola must do in order to bring back harmony into her life and in her home. So for me, this is like, it's exemplary of how Muslims and how non-Muslims, but all of us, such a great lesson in how we unlock that voice, how we give space to that voice, how we make room for it, and how we hold one another as we go about, you know, enacting these things. But like I said at the very beginning, I mean, this story is in the Quran, and yet it's not approached, it's not listened to. So sometimes you have the stories right there on your fingertips, waiting to be, you know, brought back into the light. And at other times, as Jill also said, you know, I loved what you said about dreams and how dreams allow us to think outside of like the conscious, fettered way of thinking. And I was thinking of Saadia Hartman and her work, and how she talks about the archives as something that is, you know, both a place of, both a site of showing us the possibilities of our history, but also a site from within which we are shown the huge shortcomings of the historical archive, because the historical archive is quite often a patriarchal one, and most times a white supremacist one too. So the archive is very much skewed in favor of those who hold power, but that within that's where the imagination comes in then, right? And that's where our lived experience comes in, and that's where our perspective as women comes in and allows us to be able to read these texts in a way that hasn't been before. And Simon, you said something about tradition and wanting to just basically take a bat to it, right? And it's from within the tradition, it's from within the text that already exists that all of my work is inspired by. So in this surah that I've talked about, this story that I've just talked about, Fakhruddin al-Razi, he wrote that Khola's husband was unstable, and he says, and this is his words, he says that Os's instability was not due to a mental incapacity, because if it was a mental incapacity, his utterance wouldn't have been held against him. It would have been, oh well, the pen is lifted from him. He's not what he says is not going to be taken as law. So he was within his mental faculty. His instability, Fakhruddin al-Razi says, was towards a dislike of women and a deep cowardice and insecurity regarding them. Is that not the definition of misogyny? Like, that is the definition of misogyny. That's Fakhruddin al-Razi's exegesis on this. So I think sometimes the tradition actually gives us these gifts. And the problem is that not enough of us have accessed that. And of course, there's also my work on Aisha, but I don't want to take up all the time and all the talking. So I'd love to hear from Jill on this.
I'm just going to add to that, by tradition, I would say mainstream tradition that has been carefully selected and, kind of put out there. And then, like you were saying, your recovering tradition. And I just want to say, so that chapter is in this book. And you also discuss that when the women folk sat and lamented, with Khawla, that really made me think about the grief workshop that we had earlier today, where Kohenet Rachel was talking about, women coming together, and it is a form of spiritual activism, holding together, right, and sharing that. So I just, coming from the Kohenet tradition there. So Jill, over to you.
Yeah.
Sure. I was riveted by the story of Khola, just riveted. This is amazing, and I had never heard this story, and I'm just so grateful to your telling of it. So the first thing that comes to me to say is the importance of being able to establish lineages. And by this, I don't just mean lineages in the very traditional sense, but in the sense of communities that pass on their wisdom. Because often, and I think this is true both in the tradition and in the academy, there is this sense of, well, this is legitimate, right? And these things are extraneous. And, like in Jewish tradition, right, the studies of the law, right, of the Talmud, right, of the Bible, right, this is all legit. And these things are folk traditions, right? These things, like, for example, what Kohenet Rachel brought us around the traditions of mourning women, right? These are folk traditions. And this has real consequences, because that means that when the society transitions in time, for example, when Jewish communities had to leave often abruptly the places where they were, these traditions were lost because they weren't, or they were attenuated because they weren't written down in ways that somebody could easily look them up and say, oh yes, this is what we were supposed to do. It was much more easy to displace them, as communities transitioned over time, right, and from place to place. So asking the question of who has decided, right, which of these traditions are sacred and which of them are superstitions, right? Which of these traditions are to be observed by the whole community and which are peripheral, right, and can easily be dropped. Those framings have such huge consequences, and particularly, for women, for non-binary people, for people on the margins of authority. And And this can include traditions around right, garmenting, around amulets, right, things that that were made in the home that the women often had some spiritual input into and control over. So for me, part of the need to transform what leadership looks like, what teaching looks like, right, in the Jewish world and in the larger religious world, has to do with this question of framing, right, and acknowledging that we get to decide what stories are central, right. We can take a story that nobody teaches and say, what about this story? This is a central story. One of the stories that has gotten so much play in the Jewish community in recent years is a story of Sarah bat Asher, Sarah, the daughter of Asher. And she is the granddaughter of Jacob and Leah. And when the brothers come back from Egypt and they have to tell their father that that Joseph is still alive, and whoops, they sold him into slavery, they tell Sarah, you go and tell him. And she brings her harp and she sings it to him while he's praying. And this is how he is able to absorb the information and not lose his mind and not have a heart attack. And he blesses her with eternal life. And so she becomes like this Elijah figure who's always around. And she's the one who confirms that Moses and Aaron are legitimate leaders who will bring the redemption. And she's she goes into the wilderness, and she goes to the land with the people. And there is this story in the Talmud in which she's still alive in the time of the Talmud, like 1,000 years later, she's still alive. And the rabbis are debating, what did it look like when the sea parted? Like, what was it like? And she sticks her head in the window, and and they have all these ideas. And she sticks her head in the window and she says, it wasn't like that at all. I was there. And I can tell you what it looked like. And what I love about this story, though she's basically invented by the sages, she just appears in a brief lineage in the Bible. But what I love about this story is it's a kind of conscious or unconscious acknowledgement that there's a story that they don't know, right? There's a witnessing that they don't have, right? And Sarah from outside, right, from the window, right, brings in this truth, right, that they are making up, but that they don't actually have access to. And I find her a really good role model, right, for what's necessary now, right, which is to say, I was there, I am there, right, I am in my own lived experience, and you don't know what that's like, right? And, of course, we can all say that to one another, but to allow for a kind of window to open, right, in the community, in the tradition. So that's and sometimes it's easier for us to do it from within institutions that we build ourselves, because when you go to the seminary, right, or whatever the institution is for kind of becoming a voice of spiritual authority and service and comfort, often there's a kind of implicit like loyalty. There is a sense in which people feel that they don't want to say things that are too radical, because they want to be perceived as loyal to that institution and not as trying to make radical change. So sometimes it can be helpful for us to develop those voices in places where we don't have that that subtle pressure. So I don't remember now if I answered the whole question, but that's what's coming up for me in response.
Jill, can I ask you a question on that story? What a fascinating story. So when Sarah says through the window, it wasn't like that, I was there. Does the story tell us what the reaction of the men is?
It doesn't, but what it does say is that the men are talking about how it looked like a lattice work, or like bushes, like there was kind of a partial barrier. And she says, no, it looked like windows. It looked like clear windows. Wow. And, or some people say the word means mirrors. So there's silence from the rabbis in the study hall. Like they just received this from her, and it's a really powerful humbling of their voice, I think.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I just think of it in terms of, so I also love that you said that she sang, that she sang to Jacob, what happened with Joseph. And it reminded me of something I read that Amina Wadud had said years and years ago. So I don't know, I don't think it's in any of her works per se, but she'd said something around about how we are singing a song, and when you hear the song, that you might find yourself recognizing the song. So hum along until the words come up on your tongue, something along these lines. And I was thinking about that statement of hers just today, because I was thinking about my mother-in-law, who currently, she has dementia, and she's just, with dementia, what that's like, it's such a tragic disease, but once you get beyond its tragedy, it's fascinating as well. And like, we were traveling with my mother-in-law, and she said, go on, play some Elvis, right? So we said, okay, we played some Elvis. Now, she has not listened to Elvis in decades, but she sang word for word with him. I was shocked. This isn't somebody who had, great memory either. She was always known to being a little bit scatty. And I just found it amazing, the power of song. And I was thinking about, because we were talking about divine voice, and I was thinking about the power of song, melody, and how that seems to be, there's something primordial in that, right? Because the song that Amina was talking about was one that I heard first hummed through her work. And I found myself first rejecting that sound because it was too loud for me. And then but it stayed in the background, and its volume slowly went up again, and I found myself singing along. And so, yeah, even the idea that Sarah sings this really difficult news to Jacob, I think there's something really profound in that. I mean, we don't have so much. I mean, one of the things that I've loved about RAYfest over the last few days is actually how much you guys have really centered music and voice in all of this. And yesterday, Fatima's recitation of Ayatul Kursi, I felt like crying. It was so beautiful. And then with the translation as well. So, and there's something really melodious in that. So I think the way in which voice manifests as well is so, multitudinous. It's not necessarily always going to be in sort of, the ways that we imagine. It can be in so many different ways. So yeah, I love this story. I'm going to be thinking on this, because what I have found is that when you offer a reality like Sarah is offering, I've often found pushback from people as well, who'll go, no, you can't share that story. You can't share that story. You're going to lead people astray. And I was like, but if this story is true and you accept that it's true, then what is it that you're afraid we're going to lead people astray from? And that's where I think we find that, and you talked about loyalties, loyalties to institutions, that people have a loyalty to what they think is religion, but it's actually just dogma, it's ideology. And this, again, Simon will recognize as something that, we'll often talk about in our sessions, that, we can also fall foul of dogma and ideology. So, we want to be careful not to end up reenacting that same violence, but now from a different stance. But yeah, so I love that the rabbis sat in silence and allowed Sarah to speak, because I think we're a long way from that, sadly.
Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, I think, the understanding the different types of voice, and also realizing that the moments in life when we are not ready to receive them. I'm with you there as well. Like sometimes hearing something and just thinking, oh, that just sounds too kooky. And then here I am 10 years later being, kind of like, I don't know, what am I, a pagan Muslim or something? Like this is like accepting and doing all sorts, because that's where I am in my journey, and being open enough. But, so continuing with this voice and tradition, something else that I wanted to kind of bring up. So this is Jill's book, The Hebrew Priestess, which I also highly recommend. I'm going to put the links for both books in chat, because some folks have been asking. And when we had our pre-festival chat with all the contributors in the conversation with Jill, I asked the question, and I noted it to ask today as well, was, so you have, you go through different types of priestesses that you've reclaimed. And one of the questions was, how did their voices differ, and how did they speak to you when you were, kind of sitting with them, and how are there particular priestess voices that are more challenging for the traditional spaces, and which ones are those? Because I definitely want to spend more time with them. So thank you.
Wow, thank you. I love this question. Thank you so much, Saima. So one of the core practices in the Kohenet community is to sort of be in discernment of the different, these kind of different, we call them priestess paths or netivot, which are like roadways, different avenues that one can take in the realm of spirit. And, one of the reasons that we began our program by discerning these different pathways was we wanted to be very clear that there are different ways to connect to spirit, and there are different ways to lead, and there are different ways to create. And we didn't want to create a kind of cookie cutter, this is what a Jewish priestess looks like, this is what a spiritual leader looks like. We wanted to acknowledge that there are people who lead with their voices, and there are people who lead with their hands, right? And there are people who lead because they work with the ancestors, and there are people who lead because they work with justice, and there are people who lead because they work with art. And so we searched really through Israelite and then later, generations of Jewish tradition to see what are the different pathways. Kohenet Rachel channeled one of them today, which was the mourning woman, right? The women who do grieving, right? Those who do grieving. The ones who are the wise ones, right? The Hebrew word is the chachama, right? Or the wise woman, right? Or the wise one, who is the storyteller, right? And the reconciler, right? The one who can help us when we've gotten to an insoluble conflict or problem. The prophetess, right, who is the singer and dancer, but also the one who proclaims justice, right? The Balat Ov, which we've called different things, the spirit vessel, the spirit channel, the shamaness, who is the one who allows the voices of the, of the spirits to come through. There's the seeker who's on a journey, the mother who's right, or the one who is compassionate, and the weaver, right, who's always integrating and bringing things together. And one of Kohenet Kashir Halev Fife, who's our executive director, sometimes says, the Kohenet practice is to figure out which one of the priestess paths is needed and embody that, as fully as you can. And I have found that is the practice, and also to recognize that we need the whole community to lead, right? We need the whole community, because my constellation of inner voices, right? My inner council is going to be different than yours, is going to be different than someone else's. And my voice is, right? Any voice needs to be balanced by other voices. But you asked this question of, well, which ones are the really troublemakers? I want to meet those. And I think it's different for different people. One of the paths is the shrine keeper, right? And we look at the women who tended altars, right? Who created ritual space, who tended sacred shrines. And we often talk about how the shrine keeper and the fool don't get along. The shrine keeper wants everything to be orderly and beautiful, and for everyone to have a wonderful, reverential, experience. And the fool is just going to come in and knock over, the vase of roses, and say things that are disruptive. And sometimes those two don't get along, but in some way they're both necessary, because the fool is the one who's going to say not only what's beautiful, but what's true, right? And it's going to challenge, right, what the practices that have been laid down, right? Or sometimes I think about the wise woman and the mother, right? Like the one who sort of wants to make things safe, right? And the one who is prepared to name what's difficult. So I think I would say that all of them, have their potent challenges, right, to the way things are, to the way that we expect things to be. But probably for me, it's the Neviah, the prophet, the prophetess, who is, the one who is most likely in my own life to shake things up, because the prophetess doesn't care what has already been revealed. Right? The prophetess arrives with a sense of what must be revealed in the now, and is often the ecstatic, right? The activist, right? Who is channeling, what must happen now. And my own inclination is often to be the shrine keeper, and let's make this harmonious with what has come before. And the prophetess shows up and says, "This is, there are needs of the moment that we must address." So that's the radical voice for me as I'm thinking about it right now.
Oh, thank you so much, Jill. And really what comes to me is that I feel like both of you are embodying that prophetess voice, in the work that you're doing. It's just, yeah, it's really powerful. And completely connecting to what I was wanting to ask Sophia, if you have anything that you'd like to reflect back on what Jill shared, but also really when we're talking about a prophetess that is bringing something, your book on Hazreti Aisha, please do share more about that.
A lovely segue. That I was actually just thinking as Jill was sharing that the prophetess in a way becomes the real shrine keeper, right? Like she's the one that is doing the actual legitimate work of protecting that space in the way that it should be, rather than in the way that somebody else has decided it should be, right? Like she's going to come in there not quite like the fool, but with something powerful to say that is relevant for the here and now. And it very much made me think of the work that I've done on Aisha, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. She's well known, both loved and loathed as well in various communities. So she's a really fascinating character anyway. But I did my PhD on a critical study and translation of a 14th century text by Imam al-Zarkashi, who was of Turkish origin, but lived in Egypt during the Mamluk period. And he did this incredible service for the Muslim community and beyond, where he collected over 200 statements of Aisha, where she is refuting or correcting, and in some instances corroborating statements made by primarily male companions of the Prophet ﷺ. And it was a 3-year labor of love, that book. I mean, it's going to be published next year. I've got 2 books on Aisha coming out next year, which is just phenomenal. And very much like yourself, Jill, when you were talking about, you ask yourself which of the priestesses that you need to sort of embody or channel. For me, it's Aisha. It's always Aisha. I said to my husband once, I said, how mad does it sound if I tell you that I talked to Aisha the whole way through my writing my thesis, and how mad does it sound if I tell you that when my examiners told me, congratulations doctor, you have passed your viva, that I sort of in my head felt like I went like this to high five Aisha from behind, because I very much, for my work, it was really important to me that contextualization of texts is so important, historicizing them, giving the full expanse of the context within which these occurrences happened. But also what I found really important was to give Aisha some personality again. I feel like the personalities of women, well, first of all, women are sort of begrudgingly allowed into this role of being a part of our intellectual heritage. But then when we have, any exploration of who they are, it's very sanitized. It's just a case of who they married, who they were born to, where they lived when they died, and where they're buried. There's no real exploration of what was her character like. What can we mine the traditions for to tell us more about her character. And what I found time and again was a woman who very much, sort of fits that model of the priestess that you've just spoken, the prophetess, sorry, that you've just spoken of, Jill, somebody who speaks in the now, somebody who has a foresight as well, who's concerned and whose energy is very much rooted in an ethic of care towards her community, and in particular those who sit at the margins of her community. Again, it links to the story of Sarah. She's being heard by the people in the room, by the rabbis in the room, but she's still standing outside. And I like that she doesn't come in. I think we need to build our spaces outside of these rooms. We don't want to come into the rooms. We want to inform those who are in them and invite them to come outside and meet us where we are. And I think that's what I've found with the work on Aisha that I've done, where, what you see in her is this constant return to the Quran. She is constantly saying, hang on a minute, what you've said is not correct, because this is what the Quran says. And no man's voice is going to hold priority over that of God's. That's just not going to happen on her watch. The other thing that she does is she safeguards the prophetic tradition. Somebody will come and say something completely misogynistic, completely outrageous, like Abu Huraira will say that a woman and a dog and a donkey, if they come in front of a person who's praying, nullify the prayer. And Aisha is aghast. She's so angry. The tradition actually says that, it's as if a fissure has gone through her down to the ground and cracked the ground beneath her. And a lightning bolt has gone up through her and into the sky. That's how angry she is. And she says, are you equating us to dogs and donkeys? She's really angry, and she's safeguarding what, the prophetic tradition there. She's like, absolutely not. The prophet never uttered such words. And so what my work does, because sadly what we find is through the canonization process and through the process of sort of formalization of religion, institutionalization of religion, and that process has been a solely male project, means that there's been no space for women's experiences to inform that, and for non-binary folks' experiences to inform that. And so what I've found with this work is that Aisha's voice is disruptive in the most emancipatory ways, and that also she, no one can deny her. No one amongst the Sunni Muslims who would begrudge what Aisha has said. All of the statements in that collection are considered sound by the higher standards of hadith scholars, and so it presents a really profound alternative of looking at the Islamic tradition, whether that's with regards to our tafsir, our exegesis of the Quran, whether that's to do with our legal theory, whether that's to do with our everyday praxis, whether that's to do with our attitudes towards one another. It fundamentally shakes the ground on all of these all of these arenas. So yeah, I'm very excited for that to come out, and I think it's just vital work. I'm also, and I'll be honest, I'm also very much braced for a backlash. There's that as well. There's this, I very much aware that it is an act of rebellion, and it's an act of courage and bravery, but Jill, again, something you mentioned earlier is community building, and I think that there's enough community now around me and they are who are important to me, and if that work is going to reach them, that's what's important, and if I can play that role, I will be very happy.
Oh, Sophia, that's it's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing about her. And yeah, we'll be there. We'll be there with flags and whistles and drums, and yeah, be the community that supports it. I'm really so excited. I'm just thrilled to know somebody who's working, on sharing Aisha's words. There's so much more I could say about that. We do have a question. But I forgot to say to you at the beginning, to both of you, that if you would like to share a poem or a song or a chant. I know, Jill, that you did that in the first year, and we still have people commenting on just really loving hearing you share the chant that you did about the Shekinah. So I'll invite both of you, or if you want to recite something or share a favorite hadith of Aisha, whatever you wish. It would be lovely to close out like that. But I have a question here, and it's actually connected to the session we had this morning with Mary Elsa and Amna. And Mary Elsa had mentioned the bat call in relation to voice. And I had a note here as well that I'd made about it, about bat call being the daughter of the voice. And just again showing how much I love Aisha. Like when I hear the daughter of the voice, I think of Aisha. So again, these connections between. So the question was just if you could speak more about this, and after, Sophia, if you have anything to add to it, that would be wonderful. So Jill, thank you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to say to Sophia, you are absolutely not mad. That is, it is clear manifestation. If I can say humbly say so, and it's a wonderful example of bat kol, because the bat kol, the daughter of the voice, was a way that the rabbis of the Talmud talked about prophecy after prophecy. Like they kind of closed the chapter of prophecy. They said that the prophets existed in a particular time, and now we're doing text study, and prophecy is receded into the background. But they acknowledged the possibility of a bat kol, and a bat kol was a kind of prophetic voice that appeared within someone. So one example, they look at the story of Solomon. Right, where he sees the two mothers, and they both had children, and then they come and one of the children is dead, and the mother says the living child is mine, and the other mother says no, the living child is mine. Right, and in order to determine whose child it is, Solomon says, well, let's cut the child in half. Right, and the second mother says, no, let her have it. Don't cut it in half. Right, and the first mother says, yes, let's cut it in half. It shall be neither mine nor yours. And it's immediately clear, right, who the true mother, in whatever sense we might take that, right, who the true mother is. And the Talmud says this was the bat kol. So the bat kol said to Solomon, the truth of the matter. Sometimes a bat kol will come and proclaim something. When an event is occurring, a divine voice will come and say something about that event. When a rabbi was martyred, the bat kol says, happy is this one who died with God's name on his lips. And so it's like the bat kol is a kind of intuition that is supported by the divine, and I think that's, that is a way of talking about sacred imagination. It's a way of talking about the ability to feel into the larger voice of the cosmos. So and it's a feminine term, right? The daughter of a voice. It means an echo. It's a divine echo. It's an echo because it comes through. It's bounced off of, right, a particular person or entity. So I think your work with Aisha, feels very, very relevant to this idea and experience, Sophia.
That's very kind. Thank you, Jill. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, yeah. Simon, could you repeat your question? Could you repeat the question that was originally asked?
So it was just about sharing more about the bat kol in relation to the voice and her voice. And I was, I had made the note that bat kol is a daughter of the voice, and it immediately made me think of Aisha. And then here you are, and this question is being asked about that.
Yeah. So Aisha is interesting. What I find interesting about Aisha's story as well, though, is that I have to acknowledge that it's Imam al-Zarkashi, a male scholar who had the foresight to put these these statements of hers together, and to put them together in such a way that is very forceful. So most hadith books are either categorized according to certain themes. So a lot of them will start with sort of they may follow the legal theory. So it will start with worship, and then it will move on. Well, sorry, it'll start with intention, and then purification, and then worship, and then it will move on to the more profane stuff. But he categorizes his according to the Musnad tradition. So the Musnad tradition is to categorize your statements according to who it is that has narrated the story. Now, his is not so much a case of categorizing according to who narrated, but categorizing according to who is being corrected by Aisha. So he's very much centering her as someone who is the great corrector. And these aren't minor names, for Muslims who are learned on the tradition, and indeed for those who are not, they will recognize these names. They are the Ibn Umars, they are the Umar ibn Khattabs, they are the Abu Hurairas, they are these men who we admire and who we have a lot of respect for, but she is holding them to account. And the very fact that she does that reminds us of their fallibility. What's happened, and Islam is a deeply monotheistic religion. It came with the intention of shattering anything that came between God and the worshipper. Anyone that pitches themselves between Allah and their worshipper is a henchman of shaitan, is somebody of Satan, is somebody who has imposed themselves and disrupted the core quality of Tawheed in Islam, the oneness of Allah and the unicity of Allah, the unifying nature of Allah. And if we are going to disrupt that, then we are falling into the very opposite of what Islam has come to enact. We are falling into shirk. We're setting up partners with Allah. So Aisha has gone to the very core of the prophetic tradition and become a defender of Tawheed, because many people would now argue, oh, well, you can't say anything, you can't, all the companions are equally reliable, equally trustworthy, and equally noble in the sight of God. And yet we know that, again, the tradition itself tells us that's simply not true. We know that Umar ibn al-Khattab was preferred over others. We know that Abu Bakr was preferred above others. And we know that above all of them, it was Aisha who was preferred, right? The Prophet is very clear in his love for Aisha. He's not embarrassed about his love for Aisha. He's very sweet in his love for Aisha. When a companion asked the Prophet, who is your most beloved? He says, Aisha. And the guy's like, no, I mean, not from your wives. And he's like, her father, still connected to Aisha. It didn't say Abu Bakr, her father, and I just love the link that the Prophet always retains to her, and how even in his dying, he asked to be in her home, and he dies in her embrace. And the embrace of a woman is so important in the life of the Prophet. So when the first revelation came to the Prophet, when he was out in Mount Hira and he was, meditating as he was wont to do, and Gabriel comes and tells him to recite, and he says, I am an unlearned prophet, I don't know, I can't recite. What do you want me to recite? What is this? And then he descends from the mountain, absolutely petrified, shaken to his core, goes back to the arms of his wife Khadija, and he's telling her, cover me up, cover me up. He's so frightened. He just wants to be enveloped in as many layers as possible, held and made to feel confident and comfortable again. At that point, if Khadija had said, I think you're running a temperature and you're hallucinating, there would be no Islam today. There would be no Islam today. It was the embrace of a woman in which Islam was born, not at the recitation of Iqra. it was in the embrace of the woman, Khadija radiallahu anha. And then when he passes, he asks, when is it my turn to be with Aisha? When is it my turn to be with Aisha? And then he finally goes to Aisha, and he's content and relaxed at last, and he passes away in her arms. And I think that that is so significant. And he's buried in her room, right? In her room, he is buried. And so that embrace in death, she maintains beyond his death. She continues to hold him in embrace by protecting his tradition. And she does that to her dying day. So absolutely, I think Islam its foundation is within the embrace of a woman, whether that was Khadija at its start or whether that was Aisha at its end. And I think it's the work of women that's going to continue to hold Islam in this strong embrace.
Wow. I don't really. Yeah. That's. Thank you. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank both of you. So much love and gratitude for this amazing meeting of prophetic daughters of voice. Thank you so much both for being with us today. There's just so much more that I want to ask and continue, and I'm just thinking, right, we're going to have a mini festival in between as well to continue the conversations. Yes. I am actually speechless. I'm kind of like drawing a blank now. Like, before we go into our closing, I will just say that the next session is with Woman Stand Shining, Pat McKay. That will be at 7 o'clock in an hour's time. She will be offering the closing contemplation for this wonderful weekend with you amazing women and amazing participants. Thank you so much. And we will close with the voice that will continue beyond this session. And maybe I could invite Sophia to share first, and then Jill, we can end in the silence after your sharing. I won't play any music. We will just let you take us out. But yeah, thank you so much, and so much gratitude.
Oh, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, especially Simon, Fatima, and Amira, and Uzma behind the scenes, and especially Jill as well for this phenomenal conversation. I hadn't prepared anything, but what I'm thinking is, I started by talking about Surah Mujadila, so maybe I'll just recite the first few verses of that, and I'll give a translation, and I'll just hope that it's the right thing to have done. So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قد سمع الله قول التي تجادلك في زوجها وتشتكي إلى الله والله يسمع تحاوركما إن الله سميع بصير الذين يظاهرون منكم من نسائهم ما هن أمهاتهم إن أمهاتهم إلا إن ولدنهم وإنهم ليقولون منكرا من القول وزورا وإن الله لعفو غفور والذين يظاهرون من نسائهم ثم يعودون لما قالوا فتحرير رقبة من قبل أن يتماسا ذلكم توعظون به والله بما تعملون خبير فمن لم يجد فصيام شهرين متتابعين من قبل أن يتماسا فمن لم يستطع فإطعام 60 مسكينا ذلك لتؤمنوا بالله ورسوله وتلك حدود الله وللكافرين عذاب أليم إن الذين يحادون الله ورسوله كتبوا كما كتب الذين من قبلهم وقد أنزلنا آيات بينات وللكافرين عذاب مهين. I'll stop there. That's the first 5 verses. So in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, Allah has indeed heard and accepted the statement of she who disputes with you, O Muhammad, concerning her husband, and carries her complaint in prayer to Allah, and Allah always hears the arguments between both sides from amongst you, for Allah hears and sees all things. If any men among you divorce their wives by dhihar, calling them their mothers, they cannot be their mothers. None can be their mothers except those who gave them birth. And in fact, the words both inquisitous and false. But truly Allah is one that blots out sins and forgives again and again. But those who divorce their wives by dhihar then wish to go back on their words that they have uttered, that they should free a slave before they touch one another. You are admonished to perform this, and Allah is well acquainted with all that you do. And if any has not the wherewithal to be able to do so, then he should fast for 2 months consecutively before they touch each other. But if any is unable to do so, then he should feed 60 of the poor. This is so that you may show your faith in Allah and in their messenger, and these are the limits set by Allah. For those who reject Allah, there is a grievous penalty. And those who resist Allah and their messenger will be humbled to dust, as were those before them, for we have already sent down clear signs, and for those who reject this will have a humiliating penalty. This is the response of Allah to the voice of a woman in complaint.
So powerful, thank you. So the chant that I want to offer to close was written by Kohenet Raina Grace Matthews, and it is in memory of Kohenet Andrea Jacobson, who died this time last year on Yom Kippur, and who taught me so much about inner peace. And her priestess title that was specific to her was Choda Be'or Uva'ayin, one who rejoices in light and emptiness. And the song honors her teachings and her memory. And I also want to thank all the organizers, Saima, Fatima, Amira, Ozma, and you, Sophia, and everyone who was here. May Spirit continue to connect us. We are breath and we are bone, becoming earth, becoming stone. We are breath and we are bone, becoming earth, becoming stone. We are coming home. We are becoming home. We are fire, we are blood. Through our grief we send the flood. We are fire, we are blood. Through our grief we send the flood. To praise, we praise our love. We praise our love. We are light and we are space. We are darkness, time and place. We are light and we are space. We are darkness, time and place. We empty, we empty to behold. We empty, we empty to behold. We empty, we empty to behold. We empty,